Welcome everyone to this lecture on Postcapitalism, which is organized as part of the University Maastricht Sustainability Week. And this lecture is organized by PINE, which is a committee here at the university, which stands for Pluralism in Economics. So we are a committee committed to reforming the economics education, because we think that the current way that economics is being taught is not very pluralistic. So basically only the neoclassical school and many of the global issues like sustainability are widely ignored in economics. So that's why we're committing to this purpose, and why it also fits very well in this theme of the Sustainability Week. And first of all, also thank you to the organizers of the Sustainability Week for making this possible. Thank you, Anitra, for joining us from Melbourne, although the time zone difference. And also, thank you to everyone in the audience for participating. And then I would pass it on to Sophia, who will then introduce the speaker of the day.
Thanks, Janne. So I will briefly introduce today's lecturer, Anitra. She will give us approximately 40-minute talks, and the rest of the meeting will be up for your questions. So for those of you who do not have today's lecture description at hand, Anitra is an activist scholar affiliated with the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute at the University of Melbourne, Australia, from where she's currently speaking. Anitra has been working on sustainability from different academic angles throughout her career, and she's very eclectic in her interests and activities, but environmental consciousness and fairness commitment are identifiable trends throughout all different works. And in light of these values as well, that she says came to question the role of money and the limits that it can bring about when trying to become a more sustainable society. And these concerns have been transformed into her newly published book, Beyond Money, a Post-Capitalist Strategy, of which I'm personally very curious to know more about. And for that, I hand it over Anitra, whom I would like to thank again for joining PINE today.
Well, thank you to PINE Maastricht for asking me to talk today. I'll start with the challenges that we face, then I'll sketch out why we need to go beyond monetary relations of credit and debt, before discussing how we might operate a world beyond monetary values and relationships. As Sophia said, I'm speaking to you from my home in Castlemaine, Central Victoria, in Australia's most southeastern mainland state. I live in a settler society that colonised a continent with around 600 distinct Indigenous peoples, each with their own language and country. Today, Indigenous peoples are only about 3.5% of the Australian population. So I first respectfully acknowledge elders past, present and emerging of the Kulin Nation, on whose unceded lands I live and work, specifically the Djarawong peoples of the Jara country. And second, elders of the Gunai Kurnai peoples on whose land I was born. Third, I respectfully acknowledge Indigenous peoples participating today and Indigenous peoples of lands on which non-Indigenous peoples participants live. Indigenous practices are profoundly significant to the future sustainability of our planet, which relies on drawing on their knowledge and approaches. So here, let me just move on to the next slide. Here, I'm 8 hours ahead of you. It's 5:30 in the afternoon and we're in autumn. Autumn is probably the most beautiful season in my region, as the weather is mild, neither too hot nor too cold. Moderate weather is especially significant because all of Australia now is being affected by climate change. Solar ultraviolet radiation levels here are around double those in the Netherlands, and all school children and children at daycare centres have needed to follow a no hat, no play policy for years. They always need to wear hats when they're outside. The driest inhabited continent on Earth, Australia was already subject to extremes of weather. Yet, in the last few years, we've experienced fires and floods with unprecedented characteristics. We're seeing the sixth mass bleaching of the Great Barrier Reef off the Queensland coast. Shown in this slide, the Great Barrier Reef is the largest coral reef system in the world, featuring a rich and complex ecosystem with a unique level of biodiversity. Coral can recover from mild bleaching, but it dies from severe heat stress. Reef scientists say that unless we quickly cut carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere that have caused global heating, then massive reefs like these will be lost. The 2019, just have to get out of that. The 2019-2020 bushfires centering on the state of New South Wales led to the deaths of over 3 billion animals, including 33 people. The 2009 Black Saturday bushfires in my state of Victoria resulted in 173 fatalities over 21 days. Recent rains in late February and March have destroyed around 30,000 homes, killed at least 23 people, and the flood recovery is expected to cost the government alone more than 6 billion Australian dollars. Both the fires and the rains were so fierce that they developed their own weather systems. The rain bombs associated with the flooding are described by weather experts as tsunamis from the sky, and by journalists as weather on steroids. Brisbane, the capital city of Queensland, one of the worst affected states, received around 80% of its annual rainfall in just 6 days in late February. Similarly, massive thunderstorm-type clouds, referred to as pyro-CB, form over very dry and hot fires to generate their very own winds and lightning. It will come as no surprise to you that firefighters and disaster relief workers, whether they be experts or volunteers, have no experience of responding appropriately to these kinds of challenges. In the fires and floods, many local residents relied on themselves. Such disasters leave residents without access to fresh water, food, electricity, or healthcare, even if they require urgent medical treatment. In the recovery stage 2, communities found little immediate and crucial support from government. The army was called in on both occasions, but officers were neither prepared nor equipped to address people's everyday challenges relating to food supplies and housing, let alone fix challenges to all kinds of domesticated and wild animals, the massive damage to landscapes and to infrastructure. They often simply assess the damage and then reported back to government agencies. So, people are disillusioned with governments, not only because of neoliberal economic policies, which favour the rich and decrease social welfare, but also because lots of people are now being affected in their everyday lives and livelihoods by impacts of climate change that we expect will only increase in the future. And you probably already know that the Liberal Australian government in power in Australia over the last decade has been notoriously resistant to addressing climate change, let alone its impacts. Still, in reality, all governments around the world are failing to work fast enough. Governments often work with private interests to administer their policies, but many market activities are outside state control. States fail to regulate or to subsidise practices that enhance people's well-being. An example is housing. House prices have been rising right across the world, including in both the Netherlands and Australia, impacting younger people, including students, even more than others. House price rises preclude many from entering the market to purchase a dwelling, and the high cost of housing is passed on to tenants as well, increasing rents. Investors and increases in temporary tourist accommodation make the situation worse. So markets, not just states, are disappointing people. We confront massive inequities daily, including private and commercial sectors that do not produce what we want affordably or with appropriate quality. This is especially the case when we think of sustainable housing. The most ecologically sustainable housing is made of natural, recycled and sustainably produced materials, designed appropriately to minimise energy use on heating and cooling. Our future housing needs to operate on ecologically renewable and sustainable services, such as local neighbourhood scale solar-powered electricity, water, internet, and waste systems. To be ecologically sustainable, we need modest housing, as small spaces as possible, while still fulfilling our needs. Housing connected with neighbourhoods to make use of community-based care and sharing of appliances, spaces, and other goods is best. But not only potential residents, even governments have little say in housing provision. Developers decide what is produced in terms of housing, where, what style or form it takes, the size of dwellings and their services, as well as deciding the asking prices for houses. Responses to worldwide calls for more sustainable, affordable and appropriate housing, as in this slide, have produced few models that are actually pursued by commercial sectors. For instance, this eco-collaborative housing, like eco-co-housing and eco-villages, is a favoured model, including for its many non-market characteristics. But planning and building regulations and legal and financial models are formed for mainstream developments, presenting hurdles for people who want to establish eco-collaborative housing models and or simply build alternative dwellings, doing it themselves. In this way, states and markets both fail. Similarly with food, problems arise with knowing where our food has been grown, processed and prepared. In the COVID-19 crisis, breaks to long supply chain production, trade and transport made us very aware of how reliant we are on foods grown or produced a long way from where we live. In Australia, after supermarket shelves became empty of products such as toilet paper, residents thought again. Very soon, all the suppliers of seeds and seedlings, especially of food plants, had run out of stock, because people are now very interested in knowing about local growers, producers and suppliers of their basic needs. Again, COVID-19 restrictions and impacts on health sectors and productions have highlighted the massive inequalities that we face today. Due to rapacious market-oriented production for trade, there is simultaneously too little for some, but too much for others, overconsumption and obesity, scarcity and undernourishment. In all these disasters, the most disadvantaged people are the most likely to be worst impacted in the disaster and during recovery. These inequities are not new. They actually typify market societies where money rules production, land use, status, and allows for inherited wealth and advantage. But during my lifetime alone, sustainability, inequity, and quality of life had deteriorated even as consumption has increased. If we look at ecological footprint calculations made by the Global Footprint Network, we see how humanity as a whole has become unsustainable in just a couple of generations. The average life was just within one planet limits in 1970. But after that, our lives have become more and more unsustainable. Of course, this average hides massive inequities shown when we look at each national population separately. See here, Australians had already consumed by the 23rd of March this year what Earth will actually take all of this year, 2022, to regenerate. And the Netherlands, not far behind, on the 12th of April, just about a week ago. Yet our populations too include homeless people, people without enough nutritious food, and people of astounding wealth. Mining magnate Gina Rinehart is Australia's richest person with over $35 billion worth of Australian dollars in her wealth. So we need to think about limiting those with so much and enable those with not enough to get sufficient. In short, we require equitable societies. But monetary dynamics rotate precisely on more and less, rewarding and punishing with money and no money. This is one of the reasons I became involved in the degrowth movement. Degrowth advocates and activists envisage a vastly different world where everyone's basic needs are met and where we work with nature so that Earth is not damaged by our activities. Here, humans are an animal in the chain of life like others, benefiting from Earth's products and assisting in making conditions appropriate for other plants and animals. When people first encounter the word degrowth, they often think of similar sounding words such as diminish, decrease, and decline. They think poverty and austerity. In fact, degrowth has more similarities with words such as decontaminate, deconstruct, and decolonize. Here, D means to break apart, to go beyond. Degrowth means going beyond growth and prioritizing quality over quantity. We want ecological sustainability as a principle of the societies and the economies within which we live. Over the past decade, degrowth has gained increasing attention. As degrowth activist Timothée Parric tweeted recently, the latest IPCC report mentions degrowth several times. He suggested that this IPCC quote ought to be on the walls of all departments of economics. In Exploring Degrowth, a book that I wrote with Vincent Ouigy, we describe 4 spheres of degrowth movement activities. The first sphere is very personal and involves us adopting simple and convivial ways of living. These practices include working as little as possible for money in mainstream production and exchange so that we can free ourselves from the merry-go-round of growth for its own sake. This sphere easily flows onto the collective one of becoming involved in, say, housing, food and gardening cooperatives, where we live more closely, sharing and caring for one another. Vincent is a co-founder of Cargonomia in Budapest. This degrowth social formation unites a bike-making, repairing and renting cooperative with a peri-urban organic farm delivering vegetables and fruit to urban households using cargo bikes. They incorporate a social centre and training activities with hosting interns, students who go to learn about doing degrowth on the job, as well as living degrowth. The rise of degrowth, initially in France 20 years ago, contributed to a great deal of consciousness-raising activities of resistance and protest against unnecessary developments such as new airports and freeways, mining and cutting down forests. So this is the third sphere of resistance against capitalist growth. Acts of resistance involve strong alliances with movements for social and ecological justice, with climate activism and environmental movements more generally, to make the world more sustainable and just. Finally, in the fourth sphere, degrowth has expanded internationally as local networks rather than with central headquarters. It is a horizontally organised, decentralised, multi-dimensional network of activities, each activist connected to various nodes, working groups and people's assemblies. The movement has a global website, the URL I've popped on the screen there, where we share information, ideas and promote events and international and regional degrowth conferences. There are many academic supporters and critics, and a lot of passionate discussion about different ways to establish ecologically sustainable societies that mean that we live within Earth's limits. And it's here that I intervene with arguments that we can't degrow. In fact, we can't become socially and environmentally sustainable in any way, shape or form without moving beyond money and markets. Money and markets are institutions, organisational structures that enable production for trade. Production for trade has no operating systems to degrow, and this stymies the degrowth movement and agenda. Especially the economists amongst us know that firms need to calculate the monetary cost of each of their activities simply to remain solvent. All the pressures of production for trade conspire around cost cutting and rewarding cost cutters. Those who would pay their workers better wages and produce and distribute in ecologically friendly ways lose out in production for the market. So, the competitiveness and the secrecy of capitalist firms pressures them all to sell as much as possible, demand as high a price as consumers can bear, and expand their market. The profit imperative is associated with uncertainties around input and output prices, especially future prices. Because of all of these uncertainties, managers are circumstantially forced to set an asking price that they estimate will be the maximum current price that purchasers are likely to be prepared to pay. Consequently, there is an incessant focus on trade, making profits and expanding production for trade, which escalates private ownership and the social reproduction of monetary values, all of which constitutes generic economic growth. In short, profit making is an essential buffer that's systematically created within production for trade and to enable enterprises and associated individuals to operate. Even not-for-profit worker cooperatives produce for trade and aim to remain in the black, even if their profits are generally dispersed in ways beneficial to the cooperative, the workers, and even the wider community. Moreover, market-based societies are characterised by conflicts between capitalists and workers whose opposed interests both seem to be satisfied under conditions of strong growth, making more jobs and higher wages. So this is another systemic pressure to grow the economy. Finally, many agencies of the state are expected to balance their books so that even governments regard a surplus as ideal. For all these reasons, profit-making and growth are not optional, but instead mandatory in the daily operation of capitalism. The lack of collective control over and the secrecy surrounding production for trade, competition, and associated markets and waste, together with insecurities around sufficiency of private savings, all contribute to anxiety for consumers maintaining savings and assets, that is money. Markets and money control us through booms and busts and increasing webs of credits and debts. We all live like this in a globe of nation states, which are all mainly interconnected through production for trade. Trade matters even cause war, and trade sanctions are used as strategies in wars. Military equipment is produced to sell. Meanwhile, as degrowth advocates and activists emphasise, the two great challenges of social inequities and ecological sustainability can only be addressed by economic practices that deliver everyone's basic needs, neither more nor less. Such economies are oriented around enough or sufficiency, but market-based firms are not designed and cannot be reformed to simply fulfill everyone's basic needs, nor do they integrate the regenerative needs of Earth into everyday economies of care and reproduction. Instead, money is a carrot and a stick. Capitalist investors and managers decide what is produced and how it is produced based on their monetary formula of money making more money. Monetary calculations and budgets. Access is limited by whether you have any or enough money. And each person needs different amounts of money because all of us has different unique needs. So say even a minimum income monetary scheme or the idea of everyone living on the same wage inevitably fail. Monetary activities in competitive market economies pressure exploitation of Earth too, just when we need instead to be integrating Earth's regenerative needs into economies of care and reproduction. The dominant value money, as in prices, contorts, even eradicates ecological values. We see this in pollution to air and waterways and degradation of lands, forests, and oceans. Exploitation by mining and clearing forests still abound all over the globe, adding to carbon emissions and damaging ecosystems in a variety of other ways as well. Moreover, market economies have tendencies to insufficiency, overproduction, and wastage. Often too, we have the problems of market mechanisms being used in environmental regulations, but not working because they involve offsets. Market economies have, in contrast, degrowth critiques and visions concentrate on real values, that is, on social and ecological values and people's basic needs. Now, a centrally planned economy might diminish the tendency for producers to make anti-social and anti-ecological decisions regarding what they produce, how they produce it, and for whom. But inasmuch as industrial technologies and markets are in place, as in past and in existing experiments of centrally planned communist or socialist countries, there are still risks of wastage and scarcity with anti-social and anti-ecological implications. So, the central dynamic in going beyond markets and money is achieved by autonomy. That is, by establishing ecologically sustainable practices via democratic self-organisation. Such co-governance can be oriented around providing basic needs for all people on earth from which we are born and to which we return when we die. An ecologically sustainable, money-free world fulfilling everyone's basic needs would be characterised by these three principles. Instead of producing for trade, local communities oriented around collective sufficiency would collectively plan and produce for their own local demand, fulfilling their real needs, neither more nor less. Instead of using the logic and language of monetary values, that's prices, production for demand is oriented around real values, that is, humane and ecological values, with the aim of preserving and enhancing humanity and earth. And instead of political, you'd say, misrepresentation in powerful states supporting capital, local individuals and communities would instead attain and maximise autonomous power over their lives via co-governance. We would live within substantive direct democracies. In other words, we would meaningfully and powerfully control our material and relational existence within, by, and for Earth. So what might a money-free world like this look and feel like? Producing for human sufficiency and living within Earth's limits requires a focus on real social and ecological values. I call that real valuism. We would co-govern all together, deciding what we make, do, and get in communities producing locally for collective sufficiency. So imagine a global network of collectively sufficient cell-like communities, each responsible for the sustainability of the local environments of which they live. Communities of various sizes living within sub-bioregions, offering direct and efficient ways of fulfilling their needs, producing locally, close to end users. Imagine each diverse, empowered community caring for Earth, organised horizontally, relatively autonomous, and seamlessly networked globally. In this world, we would have personal property, but no private property. The entire Earth is commons, with clear and universal principles for commoning, sharing land through secure and fair use rights. We all contribute a set amount of time to collective production. In return, our basic needs are met. But how would we achieve this? Well, say each household guesstimates their basic needs annually, and other people would assess and negotiate agreement on these various basic needs. Then working groups would report on the capacity of the local area and the capability of locals to fulfill those needs. We plan how we will create and care for things and decide together who gets what. Then we work, monitor, and tweak to fulfill those orders all year round. Once established, planning mainly relies on updating previous calculations and taking account of seasonal and natural factors. We produce, say, corn and apples, solar electricity, potable water, and clothes for particular, already specified people. This is production on demand. We don't need money or markets. Every service or thing created goes to those who've ordered them. We discuss and negotiate compacts, not contracts, to produce for and to receive from neighbouring or more distant communities those goods and services that we cannot find or make locally. We don't overconsume, go without, or waste. We pass on or leave things we don't need in spaces for others to use. We have collective stores for emergencies and to fulfill unforeseen gaps. So production for trade, markets and money is replaced with local decision-making, direct production on demand and distribution on the basis of need. Decision-making focuses on diverse, real, biophysical, ecological and social measures and values in an in-kind economy, taking full account of our local environment and its potential. The reward for contributing to collective daily tasks is lifelong security of communally meeting our and Earth's basic needs. We engage together respectfully to make decisions on local production and the terms of exchange, the compacts with the producers that are beyond our community. Real social and ecological values offer the democratic and materialist terms for replacing money as the organising principle of society. Collectively satisfying everyone's basic needs, we would fulfil our real human potential as creative, active beings with real freedom, real liberation, and real power. So I'm just going to stop sharing now as I come towards the end of my talk. I can hear you all thinking that that's all very well, but how do we get from here to there? It's a good question. 5 of the 8 chapters in my book, Beyond Money, A Post-Capitalist Strategy, address the transition. Already in certain areas or at particular times in most people's lives, we think of in terms of real values and we make decisions that are based on real values. We decide that we want to work in medicine or healing professions, regardless of wages or hours of work, because we believe in helping people. Many people who work in the arts take a similar attitude. We enjoy many cultural activities through direct sharing. We have children and care for friends, sick and elderly people without payment. As explained through the 4 spheres of degrowth activities, we can combine distinct strategies. Many degrowth activists work in the paid sector as little as possible, say 2, 3, a maximum of 4 days per week. This enables them to take up alternative unpaid or lowly remunerated work, say in living laboratories of cooperative or collective activities. A lot of us do voluntary unpaid work, which we believe in because it is socially and or environmentally beneficial. We might be climate activists or environmental justice advocates and spend a lot of time and energy at actions or politicising and educating or training people, irrespective that we do all this free. Many people who have occupied buildings, territories or locations in the name of a cause temporarily establish money-free relations, production and exchange to engage in lowly monetised commoning. These experiences build our skills in working out how to most easily and effectively satisfy our collective needs. Inasmuch as feminists have campaigned to enter the workforce and engage in more monetary contexts, they follow reasonable and sensible, yet reformist and compromising directions. More radical feminists invite men to do household work and childcare using non-monetary practices. Arguably, these practices operate most easily where people live and work collectively. If you live in certain best practiced eco-collaborative housing models, such as eco-villages or co-housing, you develop skills in co-governance, providing and enjoying collective meals, collective gardening, collective maintenance and building, and collective childcare. Such communities share, gifting and receiving freely all kinds of services. They also develop their communication and collective decision-making skills, taking time to listen, propose solutions, and form as consensual ways forward as possible. In some communal living, such as Twin Oaks community in Virginia, monetary engagement is minimised to instead co-govern using ecologically and socially sound reasoning and practices. Finally, in Beyond Money, there is an entire chapter on Indigenous approaches and practices. I start that second last chapter with a paragraph that I'm now going to quote by way of a conclusion. Indigenous people have constantly struggled against and alongside capitalism to maintain their substantive rights to practice traditional and appropriate collective provisioning. Historically and currently, exchange value paradigms and practices challenge, smother, and isolate non-monetary practices and modes of production based on ecological and social values. In response, Uruguayan writer of both fiction and non-fiction, Eduardo Galeano, has called for a community-based mode of production, highlighting real social and ecological values to be strengthened and expanded, inclusive of diverse cultures and practices. By extension, a successful post-capitalist movement will not simply embrace and partner Indigenous peoples' cultures and economies, but will be informed and driven by them in key strategic and cultural ways. That's it.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Anitra, for this intriguing lecture and for also broadening our imagination about the future and how we could organize society. We would like to do a Q&A session now. So for those online, you can raise your hand. It's like a button below, I think, under reactions, there's a button to raise your hand, and then I can unmute yourself, and then you can ask any questions. Okay, Leila, please go ahead.
Hi, good morning. I just wanted to thank you for the talk. It was very inspiring. I had a question because I feel like now we're a very select group of people who voluntarily came here because we already know that there should be an alternative way to how we traditionally learn economics. And I'm just wondering what you think about how we can kind of promote a transition within economics education for the general public, so to say, the people that don't know about these things yet, to also be exposed to these alternative views.
Right. Well, all of you will be, learning about degrowth, having been exposed yourselves to heterodox economics and all of these kinds of different ideas. And I just think that it's really important to speak to everyone that you know about these different ways of viewing the economy. And because I've been interested in money for decades, and right back in 1980, for instance, I was doing some postgraduate research in Mexico City. I used to speak to people because they were quite intrigued at an Australian woman at that stage, young girl, doing some research in Mexico. And I talked to them, and even people on buses there, and possibly this was because Mexico had a very high public debt, and that was very much in the newspapers. But I would talk to them about the work that I was doing about credit and debt, and what does money mean? What is money? What does it represent? All of those kinds of problems, all of those kinds of interesting and intriguing issues, because a lot of people will find a lot of curiosity in, when you question them about, well, why is petrol worth one thing kind of one day and a lot more the next, or all of these different kinds of questions, or why, the economics kind of class question about why a diamond's worth more than water when we need water to survive. All of these are really fascinating philosophical questions that can arouse people's interest. And if you can also start talking about ways in which people can make and share things and own things in common, and therefore politically govern the way that things are produced and exchanged, then we're looking at ways that involve economies that don't have money. I don't know if that helps a bit.
So I think, there's another question. I will first, I also see that there's some questions in the chat, but we will first, go to the questions of the people raising their hand. So Undine, please, you can unmute yourself.
Hi, hello. With many very interesting ideas, but I can't help to think about one thing, and I was wondering maybe you can explain, elaborate this, that you mentioned that people should not overconsume and not underconsume, right? But then I'm wondering, how do you correctly evaluate how much you need for consumption? Because you can always think of you need more. Like, I want avocados and bananas in my diet, but maybe that's not very very sustainable.
Sure. So if we're co-governing and we're living in more contained communities so that we can actually evaluate ourselves what our local, this is the most of the idea behind having smaller communities that are living off their own environments, is that you're actually then able to estimate how much your local area and exchanges with some other communities will be able to give you. And of course, evaluating what one's basic needs is always going to be controversial, and I would expect it would always be a varying kind of way of evaluating what you have. Already, for instance, in COVID-19 restrictions, and many people have, even people with a lot of money, have faced situations where there's simply not things on the shelves for them, and they've really had to think very hard about what the most important things are for them. So even if we're used to, wanting a lot of things, we can go through processes of prioritizing. Number one, we all need to have nutritious food, and we need to be warm, and we need to be able to have safe and secure places to stay, as in households and whatever. So basic needs become something that we're just thinking about a lot more, and we discuss it with our local neighbourhood, with whom we're co-producing and co-exchanging. And we're also trying to satisfy other people's needs, not just our own. So it becomes a more negotiated kind of thing.
Thank you. The next question is by Camilo.
Hi, thank you. And I have two questions. My first question is that countries in the global south, for instance, sub-Saharan Africa, only 40% of population in sub-Saharan Africa have access to drinking water. I mean, they have a lack of material necessities, and we need to boost growth. I know that I know that growth, it doesn't mean better redistribution or better income from all people. Totally agree with that. But in any case, for instance, in these countries, we need to boost growth. Not in the same way that we had done in the last years, obviously, and in the same way to produce. And I totally agree with that. But then I would like to know what is the role of the global south in this matter, because I was thinking that in some countries, unfortunately, they have to contaminate more to provide some basic material necessities for the population. This is my first question. My second question is, what is what we can do about the financial system, because all of the financial system relies on the dollar and dependency of the dollar, and there are many countries that, especially in the global south, they are facing the external restriction and many issues due to this situation. Then I would like to know what is the proposal about the financial system in the growth theory. Thank you.
Yeah, well, in terms of my own position in Beyond Money, that is why my argument is that we should go beyond money. In actual fact, capitalist systems producing for trade always build up more credit and more debt at the same time, because an investment is a credit and a debt at the same time. So building up investments, building up assets is involving more credits and more debt. And that's one reason why we are more dominated and more dominated by the financial sector. It's actually, that's part of capitalism that happens. So if in fact you're working towards non-monetary economies, then you don't have that financial sector to actually mess around with everything all the time. The idea of satisfying people's basic needs actually puts global south in a better position, because at the moment, we know, for instance, ecological economists like Jason Hickel has just done a big study. The global south is being more and more exploited for global north people to have more, okay? And this is all involved with production for trade. So the idea of having non-monetary economies based on real values and basic needs is meant to actually improve the conditions in the global south more than what's actually happening at the moment. So some degrowth advocates have written a really, well, you probably have heard of it. They have a concept called the Imperial mode of living, and it's about degrowth in the global north. And in a sense, it's just saying that we have to live with less so that other people can live better. So I suppose another way also at looking at some of this is that there's a lot of, like I emphasized, that there's a lot of knowledge, Indigenous knowledge on how to live in a more sustainable way, respecting Earth and only living with kind of enough, comes from Indigenous peoples. There's also a lot that people in the global North can learn from people in the global South who are living more simply. And I'm not saying people who are living with not enough, I'm saying people who are getting enough, like certain people who are living in community forest situations. Yeah. It's a very big question.
Did this answer your question?
Yeah. I was thinking in many issues, but yeah, I agree. I mean, I agree in some claims, but I feel that sometimes it's more difficult. For instance, the coordination between the North and the South, and in the South we have dependency on the North and not obligate people in the South to do something, or the governments to do something. But yeah, I agree that we have to be beyond of the monetary system.
Yeah. I agree with you. I mean, all of my undergraduate work was done in Latin American studies. And I was studying history, and I just decided that Latin American history could just be collapsed into economics, and how global North is just, especially United States, exploited a lot of Latin American countries. And this is a problem. Back decades ago, they used to have what they called import substitution policies. And then governments were actually following the idea of countries in Latin America building up their manufacturing sectors and being able to actually manufacture the things that they need so that they could support themselves. And I really think that this is the way that we should be moving, is more that countries and then smaller regions and are all trying to become as sufficient as possible, because it gives a greater sense of independence and autonomy. And it also means that you avoid the exploitation and the overproduction that happens by necessity through production for trade, because no one is really managing that.
Okay, thank you. So there are two questions still. I hope it's okay if these two are the last questions with an eye of the time. So, but yeah, Sashi, you can ask your next question.
Hi.
Hi.
A very long time, so it's something that still affects my culture to this very day, and I was thinking about that quite a lot, because of course a lot of the things that you've mentioned so far, they sound ideal and they sound very idealistic, especially when we take a Western North-centric view. However, when you mention, for example, the global community, then apologies for the construction in the background, then which dominant culture would this kind of assimilate from, and how would you try to mitigate the risks of not only colonizing, but also erasing entire cultures and the histories behind them through focusing on the global culture instead of also focusing on individual cultures?
Okay, so we're not looking at a global culture. We're looking at some universal principles. That is that every human has a right for their basic needs to be met, and the earth should be respected. So those would be universal principles. Just like today, there are universal principles that, you know, you have to pay for certain things, and if you don't pay, well, then you should be thrown in jail or whatever. But we're looking at glocalism. So that is that in the local sphere, then people are operating as autonomously as possible. They are the people who are deciding. Local communities are deciding what their cultural characteristics are, respecting and regenerating the local cultures that have dominated in the past. Because what we've seen with globalization and production for trade is the kind of characteristics that you're talking about, that you're frightened of happening.
Okay, then the last question by Bogdan. I think you also asked a question in the chat, so maybe you can also now,
Yes, hi, exactly. I wanted to read it out because I wrote it before you mentioned this procedure, but I think it was answered right now because it was also regarding how does this vision or is this vision compatible with a single global community? But I think you kind of addressed that now. But a follow-up question to that, which might seem simple, but I would like to see what you think about it. So in this vision, would we use laptops? And if yes, who produces laptops? Because they cannot be locally, and laptops is an example. You get my question in a way?
Sure, I do. So, number one, I think that that although we would be preferably looking at simple and convivial kinds of tools and technologies, that is, things that are very user-friendly and easy for everyone to make and repair, we would have an internet, because I think that that is the easiest way for us as a whole world community to share information and communication with one another. And imagine if we don't have money, if we don't have private property, then we don't have all of these patents and copyright over things. So we share knowledge freely. So the internet would be a place where we would share information and store off the internet a lot of that knowledge. So I see ourselves as using some kind of internet. And in terms of the kinds of things that you would need to manufacture, but only on a regional rather than community basis, yes, you would have a sort of division and specialization of economies in that sense. So I have a whole chapter that talks about what I call Yenomon, which is a local community that is living in a world without money. And there they have a soya hut, which is like a dairy, but soybeans, and it's producing soy milk and tofu and other sorts of soy products like tamari. And but the communities next door don't have one of those, and they provide that to those communities. And in the particular community that I give as an example, they're living on the edge of a lake where they're able to fish, and they fish not only for their own benefit, but they also fish and they dry those fish and they send that off to some other communities that provide them with like goods that they're not able to get. Does that help?
So, we want to ask you: is it okay if you stay a bit longer, because we still have also
I'm happy to stay longer.
questions from the room. So maybe we can have this question, please.
As you correctly point out, the transition with share conclusion.
Can you hear him, or?
I can't hear it very well, but maybe.
Maybe you can come in front and then better.
Thank you.
As you correctly point out, the transition can take place in different forms depending on the context. And I think it's fair to say that it's easier when you have more rural areas with more land resources available. So maybe you can provide some perspective of what the transition, how the transition can take place in heavily urbanized or dense cities, for example, which, for example, the country that I come from, Malta, has very little land available for agriculture, and most farmers are actually being priced out of really sort of working on these farms. So maybe you can provide some context on how it can take place in urban areas.
Yeah, well, I would imagine that we would need to have greater decentralization. I mean, I think that cities are very problematic for sustainability reasons. Cities rely on hinterlands, so they demand a lot of transport, wastage of energy and creation of carbon emissions through transport of people and goods and services. So I think that we would encourage there to be much greater decentralization. But meanwhile, while that process is taking place, there are certain communities in urban areas like Los Angeles Eco Village, and also the young housing cooperatives in Zurich in Switzerland, where people are developing links between communities of people in the city and community-supported agriculture on the peri-urban edge of cities. So I would sort of see it through people, as I say, strengthening as much as possible, using their local land, and in cities, for instance, rather than keeping on building high-rise apartments and other buildings in cities as a decentralization measure, when in available lots of land, actually people becoming more sufficient in terms of food and using areas. For instance, if you're moving towards people not working as much in manufacturing military equipment and a whole series of things that people deem is not a basic need, well, then they can actually be working more on fulfilling basic needs. And so you're seeing a restructure of the whole of a city on the basis of those kinds of things. And I suppose what I do in my book is that I refer to various examples where people, for instance, in Barcelona, there's a Cooperativa Integral Catalana, which involves thousands of people, okay, in Barcelona and in the surrounding rural areas that are building up these kinds of communities. So it is already happening. You know, the ideas that I'm bringing together in my book are things that exist already. Yes, there are some theories, and I go back into history about different ideas that different economists have had, but also I'm drawing a lot on practical experience of people, especially people in movements such as environmental justice, eco-socialism, degrowth, all of these different movements that are trying very hard to create living laboratories where they're actually experimenting to put these ideas in practice. For instance, in Germany, they have no barter, no exchange communities. All the people there are committed to trying to develop what they're maintaining themselves and their local environments without money. at the end of my book, I've got a whole list of sort of people's work, websites, communities that you can go to that are doing this kind of thing.
The last question.
So linking to this, I was wondering, do you think the most impactful action that we can do as young people living in this society is like going to live in kind of a co-living labs and eco-villages? Because sometimes I have the feeling like I'm studying sustainability and my goal at the start was making a difference in this society, in this mainstream economy and stuff. But then I have the feeling it's taking place very slow. So I have the feeling the most impactful thing I can do is going there and help to create this alternative society until it gets like the mainstream, hopefully. What do you think about that?
Yeah, the group that I was talking about in Barcelona, people like Vansa Luigi in Kaganomia in Budapest, what degrowth and like movements, solidarity movements, mutual support, mutual aid movements are trying to do is to practice these kinds of things wherever you are, whether you're in the city or whether you're in a rural area. If it is more useful for you to make these connections, it definitely improves your morale. It makes you feel better as a human being if you're surrounded a bit by people who are like yourself and aiming to do these things and experimenting the same way. But the very best is that you're still connected with people who are living differently and trying to influence them and listening to what they say, because that way we understand better why they aren't moving in that direction as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for answering all these questions. And I want to thank the audience for coming and the organizers of the Sustainability Week. Also, have a look at the chat. There's a link to a survey that you can fill out to evaluate the Sustainability Week and this event. And yeah, so thank you very much for coming and have a nice day. And you have a nice night, I think, Anitra.
Yes, I'm going to go and have my dinner now. So you enjoy your day, and I hope that the Sustainability Week ends up being really inspiring and productive for all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.